Today on Granworks, I'm going to build this floating media console. Stay tuned. I designed the floating media console to fit the AV equipment in our living room right now, but with enough flexibility to change it in the future. The top row was to hold our Xbox 360, the Kinect and the Wii sensor bar, and the Wii itself. The bottom bays hold kind of our early adapter HD DVD player, a receiver, and then a TiVo Premiere. The two side bays are mostly shut behind sliding doors and are for holding stuff like games and DVDs and really whatever the heck else we want. The majority of the console is made of 3/4 inch plywood with a poplar face frame and a 1/8 inch hardboard for the doors. I could have gotten all of the plywood pieces out of one sheet had I made it 1 inch shorter, but that didn't occur to me until it's too late in the process. I left a lot of space behind the AV components to allow not only for wires and cables to pass freely, but to also have better airflow and to give myself a little more working room since I wouldn't be able to access all this from behind after it's installed. The entire console is held up with a hardwood piece that is thoroughly connected to the console and is screwed into multiple studs using 3-inch long screws. So let's get started. One of my goals for this build was to exclusively use materials that I already had on hand. That meant pulling out this sheet of oak veneer plywood. Why do I have oak veneer plywood? I don't like the look of red oak at all. Maybe it was the only low void plywood available when I picked it up and I thought maybe I needed it sooner than I did. Well, it's here now, so now is the time to use it. I started by rough cutting the sheet into 3 strips, essentially the top, bottom, shelf, and the sides. It would have been all of the sides instead of just some of them had they all been about 1 inch shorter, but c'est la vie. I always rough cut a little bit wide so I can use my table saw to get to the final precise dimension later. Rough crosscuts are also done with my skill saw with the precision aftermath done on the table saw. And yeah, here's where I had to find a piece from my scrap pile to make one of my sides. Glad I had the scraps at least. All of the vertical pieces in the console box fit in dados or rabbets in the horizontal pieces. Most of these are too long to reasonably work with on my table saw, so the dado stack is out and a straight bit on my router is in. I built one of my scrap wood custom fit dado jigs to perfectly fit my pieces. I have a video on making one that I'll link to in the doobly-doo and maybe put up a card if I can figure out how to do that. This particular jig is mildly different than my other one in that it's designed to work with a guide bushing instead of a pattern bit. Maybe it'll be worth making a separate video for how to make those. Same concept in any event. All in all, this required 6 full dados, 2 stop dados, and 4 rabbets. I also used a custom jig that I had made for a prior project to drill some holes for future shelf pins. I have no idea why I'd want shelves in there, but adding the holes now is easy, but would be a pain later, so might as well do it as a form of future proofing. I then took the time to actually sand all of the sides that would eventually be on the inside of the console. My thinking was that it was going to be a lot easier to do that now than after it was assembled. Well, that thinking is actually very valid. But why, oh why, didn't I carry over that thought process to include painting the pieces at this stage? If sanding is easier now, then wouldn't painting be too? Yes, of course. And I would have been able to use my sprayer, which would have massively sped up this step and resulted in a much better finish. Totally kicking myself for spacing on this at the time. I originally didn't want to use any screws in this construction, although, as we'll see later, it didn't quite work out that way. But at this point, it was no screws, hence my use of dados. I was experimenting with using an acid brush to distribute the glue, but at some stage in this build, I gave up on that and reverted to use my finger to spread it out since it's so much faster. I was also using my glue bottle here, but eventually switched that out for the regular bottle since I had horribly clogged the fancier one. I did jump through a few minor hoops to ensure that these pieces were at 90 degrees to make the final assembly with the top easier. If I had made the side pockets even 3/8 inch wider, thus reducing the inner dimension by only 3/4 inch, then I could have routed out some dados in the sides and attached the top shelf using just glue. But since I didn't, the piece wasn't quite long enough, and so I had to resort to screws to hold it in place. After that, the rest of the console box assembly was pretty standard: glue, then clamp, then glue, then clamp, until it's all assembled. Same old, same old. Next up is the face frame made from poplar. Poplar because that's what I had on hand, and a face frame because, well, I needed something to put grooves into so I could slide the doors back and forth. I cut the miters on each piece individually since there was a minute difference in each dimension due to the very slight variances when creating the rabbets, mostly due to the uneven layer thickness in the plywood. This did end up biting me in an unexpected way later on. Okay, I'll stop beating around the bush. What you're going to be seeing next is me screwing up and not even realizing it until it was too late to easily fix it. See, for the grooves to work to hold the doors in place but still allow me to insert or extract them after the fact, I needed to make sure that the groove on the top piece was about twice as deep as the groove on the bottom and side pieces. That way I could just push the door into the groove on the top and it would clear the bottom frame entirely. I could then lower the door back into the bottom rail and it'd be held in place. The theory is sound. But see the orientation of the console as I'm attaching the face frame? Note how the top is closer to me? Yeah, the top, which needs the piece with the deeper groove. Well, you're noticing it now, and I noticed it after the fact, but I definitely didn't notice it as I was doing the assembly. For some reason, I thought that I was dealing with the bottom and proceeded to install the special deeper groove piece on the wrong side. I even nailed it into place. I should have realized something was wrong immediately because none of my miters were precise, even though they had been so in dry fit. I just blundered ahead for some reason though. One of the miters was so bad that I needed to fit in a patch even. Yeesh. Well, at least it was easy to patch. I just cut out a precise piece of wood and glued it in. Later, I used my belt sander to sand it flush. While I was at it, I sanded the face frame to be completely flush as well. But yeah, after that I needed to find a way to fix the grooves so that they would work as expected. The first step was going to be routing out the top groove a bit more to double its size. I decided to do this with a slot cutting bit. First though, I needed a way to stabilize the router while I made my pass, and to that end I created a custom router plate out of some thin Baltic birch plywood. It was pretty straightforward. I did forget that the 4 screws were offset on the router base, so my new custom plate ended up being skewed to one side, but that wasn't a big deal since routers don't need to face in any particular direction anyway. This all went roughly as planned, but with one slightly unplanned side effect. Since I needed 100% of the depth of the slot cutting bit for this to work, the bit's non-bearing shaft rubbed against the face frame. Not only did it burn it quite a bit, which you can see, but it also deformed the face in a few places. I didn't expect that at all. I guess even a smooth cylinder running at thousands of revolutions per minute can still hog away material just like it's a sander. That done, the next step was to fill in half of the bottom groove. I accomplished this with a strip of 1/8 inch hardboard since that was the width of the groove. The doors were the simplest part of the build. They are made of 1/8 inch thick hardboard and are essentially just rectangles with nothing special about them. Their height was important in order to work in the grooves as intended, but that was about it. I did originally think I was going to use metal hardware pulls on them, but couldn't find any that I liked and that really fit the look I was going for. And so I eventually punted on that idea. The final piece that needed to be installed was the back support rail. This was going to be supporting the weight of the entire console, so I made it out of poplar, a nice strong hardwood. I made sure to use plenty of glue, and then I further reinforced it with some beefy screws coming in from the side. And now for the most tedious and my least favorite part of this build, painting it. As I mentioned before, I really should have painted or at least primed each piece individually before assembly, as that would have made this stage so much easier. But I didn't, so it wasn't. In general, everything was sanded and primed with Zinsser BIN, which is a fantastic concealing primer. I wanted to hide the oak grain as much as reasonable. I don't have any video showing what I spent most of the time with though, and that's curious. That's the preparation of the plywood end grain on the shelves. I didn't want to use edge banding, but I also wanted it all to look seamless and smooth. So I spent a decent amount of time first filling in any gaps with putty, then sanding it smooth, then filling any remaining gaps, and then sanding again, and then repeating this process until it looked all completely smooth. I then primed it with BIN, and then repeated the process again for any remaining imperfections. I will say that my goal was realized, as the end result doesn't look like plywood edges at all. It was a lot more work than edge banding, but well, I think it looks a lot better too. The paint was normal indoor bare paint with some kind of hue of white. I applied several coats with a mix of rollers, painting pads, and brushes, and made sure to lightly sand in between each coat to make them as smooth as possible. Waiting for the paint to dry enough to sand without pilling made this process take over a week. The doors were primed and then painted orange to match the color of the room of the console will be installed in. I cut some holes in the doors as finger holes since I couldn't decide on what else to do. I may well remake these at a later date with some better choice. Maybe a custom made wood pull? Pretty much anything will look better than those holes. All of the horizontal surfaces then got a couple coats of polyacrylic. I wanted a surface that felt rock hard and didn't have the perpetual tackiness that you sometimes get with latex paint. Polyacrylic is water-based, so it's super easy to work with, but dries with a very hard and very smooth surface. And it worked! The surface has no residual tackiness at all, and so nothing resting on it sticks over time, and the whole thing feels very nice to the touch. So the console's all done, and all that's left to do is install it. I rested on a pair of speakers that are 12 inches high to get it to the rough, correct position. I then used a quick clamp with the jaws reversed and thus configured as a spreader to act like a jack of sorts to get it to the perfect level. I then drove in 3-inch long screws through the hardwood rail and into all of the available studs behind the console, after drilling pilot holes of course. The end result is very solid and stable and could theoretically even hold my weight or even more. I then inserted the AV component and voila, it's done. Yeah, for the most part, I'm pretty happy about this. There's definitely some things I would change if I was doing it again though. Like for instance, this really could have been done with one sheet of plywood instead of having to use multiple ones if I had just changed a few dimensions, a few inches in a few critical places. Second, this was a massive pain to actually paint in the end with all the little tight spaces, nooks and crannies. I would definitely paint this when it's in individual parts if I was to do this again, because it just was too much of a pain when it was actually at this point. The sliding doors are okay, but either those finger holes should be smaller or should have a different way of actually doing that because it just looks kind of out of place when they're that big. And what I'm finding too with like the Xbox and the Wii controller and stuff, that those really shouldn't be under here. This is too low down. It doesn't fit very well. That'd be a lot easier if maybe, I don't know, if I had put a hole in the back or something to put out certain cables, or I don't know, maybe as part of the wall if I had just put it up in the walls to go above the TV. But yeah, for the most part though, this was not too hard to build and looks okay and fits my components pretty well. So all in all, yeah, pretty happy about it. Thanks for watching.